Hello and welcome to the channel. Today I'm going to be talking about Jordan B. Peterson. Now, I'd just like to add the caveat that I recognise that he was a clinical psychologist for more than 20 years, where he would see up to 20 patients a week, helping them through their personal problems. And I also recognise that he's inspired many people through his lectures and tours that he does. Some of it is biblical, some of it is practical help. And I also understand that people and recognise that people have had help and found meaning and taken responsibility for their own lives in his book 12 Rules for Life. I just think there needs to be a pushback on some of his discourse and some of the things that he says in public. When I was 7 years old, my great-grandparents were babysitting me, and they were very religious people, and the topic of religion invariably came around, and they asked me, "Do you believe in God?" And my response to that was no. And they were very shocked. I got the usual, well, you're going to burn in hell, the reading of the New Testament about what Jesus said about hell, you know, the usual yada, yada, yada. Even at the age of 7, I intrinsically had a knowledge of what God and what belief was, and whether I believed in God or not. And I still don't believe in God. But the point is, the question, I don't think, has become any less complex. It's the response to whether you believe in God or not, or whether you don't, or whether you're agnostic. The response to that question is more deep and meaningful than the actual question itself. When Peterson is asked the very same question, he gives one of 3 stock responses in every single interview that he's ever pretty much had. And this is the first one.
It's none of your damn business. That's the first one. So it's like a privacy issue. Like, it seemed to me to be a question that was too private to be answered properly. And so, and you know, you could consider that a cop-out, and maybe it is.
I would argue, right, that if you're having 400 venue sellouts on the discussion of the psychology and meaning behind the Genesis stories of the Bible, and you're profiting from that, and you're also basing a good chunk of your bestseller book on biblical texts and verses, and you're constantly referencing the fact that Genesis and various other stories in the Bible have real relevance in today's society, I do think that you have a responsibility, or at the very least it's in the public interest, to have a proper response as to whether you believe in God or not. And in my mind, it's not a privacy issue, and it is indeed, as Peterson says, a cop-out. Let's take a look at his second stock response.
Well, what do you mean by believe? Like, do you mean the words? Do you mean to say the words, I believe in God? Does that indicate that you believe in God? Like, I don't know what you mean by believe exactly, because, and that's got me in trouble too, because, you know, people think that attempting to clarify the meaning of words is an attempt to escape from the question, when it's actually an attempt to specify the question. I mean,
I think if you look inside yourself, it's not a meaning of believing what you say or believing in what you act out. It's literally a very straightforward fucking question, isn't it? Do you believe in God or not? It's a simple question. I'm not being facetious, because many intellectuals have been asked the same question. I've never seen in a debate or a conversation or a lecture series where someone has to stop and redefine or reframe or look at the etymology of the words and what they actually really mean in their full context. If you went in any church anywhere in the world, any Christian church, or if you went to a mosque, any religious institution, or any school anywhere on the planet, and you said, "Do you believe in God?" it's literally a 10-second response. It's very bizarre how he avoids and is vague and evasive, and it's dressed up in all this word salad about needing to know what the question actually means and what you believe in God and what do you mean by belief. It's pompousness and pretentiousness personified. Let's have a listen to his third response.
and then the third is that I'm afraid that he might exist, which I think is the most comical of the 3 answers and perhaps the most accurate one. But then I was thinking about this today when I was thinking about what I might talk to you guys about, and I thought, well, let's go into this a little bit more. Let's say you do believe in God. say, I believe in God. It's like, okay, well, that's hypothetically pretty impressive, I would say. It's like you believe that there's a divine power that oversees everything, that is fundamentally ethical, that's watching everything you do, and you believe that. And so what effect does that have on your behavior if you believe it? Does that mean that you're, well, are you all in?
Afraid that he might exist. But it's still not answering the question, is it? And if you notice, Peterson has actually defined half of the question. So when he says, what do you mean by God? He's actually defined what God is there. So, and he's got a definition of that waiting. I mean, maybe if he didn't spend 45 minutes on what belief is, then he could put the two answers to the questions together, and still he probably wouldn't come up with anything sort of approaching a response to be a Christian. You don't have to go all in and act as though you believe in God. You can have faith and believe in God with still acting out and sinning. The two are not mutually exclusive up until the very end point on your deathbed when you renounce all your sins, right? Let's have a look at how one of my favourite public intellectuals answered pretty much the essential question about the existence of God. And although he wasn't on the fence because he was a confirmed atheist, the response is a lot better in my opinion.
Is your view exactly?
Press away.
Do you affirm God does not exist, or do you simply withhold belief?
Once I have said that I've never seen any persuasive evidence for the existence of something, and I've made real attempts to study the evidence presented and the arguments presented, that I will go as far as to say, have the nerve to say, that it does not therefore exist, except in the minds of its, except in the Henry Jamesian subjective sense that you say of it being so real to some people in their own minds.
All right, yeah,
that it counts as a force in the world, yes.
Okay, so you...
Now that was a proper calculated response, not 20 minutes of waffle on the question. In the late 1980s, the British government introduced Section 28. This legislation prohibited local authorities such as schools, libraries and other educational institutions and councils from discussing or promoting homosexuality. Now, I remember being in the classroom in about 1995 and we had a PHSE lesson. That's personal, health, social and economic education lesson. A small subsection of this class was to do with sex education. And at the end of the lesson, the teacher said, if you've got any questions about sex or anything like that, I'm going to have a box here and write them on a piece of paper, fold them up, put them in the box. Everybody had questions. When the teacher opened, he didn't open them all, he opened a selection of questions. One of the questions, and it wasn't me by the way, but someone had put into the box, Dear Mr. Culshaw, I think I'm gay. What should I do? And of course, everybody burst out laughing because at the time there was a very openly homophobic attitude in the UK. And the teacher said, I'm really sorry, but because of the Conservative government and Margaret Thatcher, I'm not allowed to discuss that. He said it's quite terrible, but I'm not allowed to talk about it. And I don't know if the person was being genuine or not, but if they were, I mean, it's pretty horrible, isn't it? Imagine how a gay pupil you would feel if you weren't even able to openly discuss it. And there was open ridicule in the education system at the time. Let's look at what Margaret Thatcher, the UK Prime Minister, said at the time.
Children who need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay.
That does not date well at all. Well, not in the UK Conservative Party anyway. If you were to get up and say that on a platform now at a party political conference, you'd be told to get the out, basically. And although there has been more of a restriction in some areas, and that's my point. My point is that over time, at least in Western democracies, as a general rule, when you take out into account things like dictatorships in brief periods of history, the trajectory for rights has gone in pretty much an upward curve. That's just rewinding the clock back around about 30 or so years. And it's a big difference. Dialing the clock forward a bit, the latest conservative moral panic, certainly over the past sort of 8 years or so, has been to do with transgender rights. And trans people deserve protection in the law. Can you imagine if you went to a cafe, for example, if you're a guy and you go to a cafe and you're ordering something in the cafe and you're a man and the person behind the bar says, excuse me, miss, what can I get you? And you're like, what do you mean, miss? What the f*** are you on about, miss? Can't you see I'm a guy? Well, if someone is in, let's say, a period of transition with their gender, they don't even have the privilege of having their own pronoun. And whilst I'm probably crudely stumbling through this argument, there is a difference between gender and biological sex. It's been proven by science. And although I'm not going to cite any studies here, it has. And although you may say, well, of course it's been proven by the leftist universities. No, they used brain chemical analysis. And it's a fact. Your biological sex is obviously what you're born with, but that doesn't necessarily determine what you're going to end up being. And don't forget, it's only for all the people on the right that are deeply offended and seem to take umbrage a tiny piece of legislation, which I will get into in a second, which is adding protection for trans people as a minority in the law. I don't really understand what the problem is. I do understand what the problem is. I feel it impinges on their traditional values, and for people like Matt Walsh, it does not compute. And the question, what is a woman, is a ridiculously sort of subversion of what the argument is really about. And with all that said, in 2017, the Canadian Parliament passed the C-16 bill, which was basically an amendment to the Canadian Human Rights Act, which added trans people as being a definition of an identifiable group to which an offence can be committed via motivated bias. Peterson came on YouTube screaming about the fact that he was being compelled in, which was a case in English common law for the first time that compelled speech had ever been used anywhere. And that wasn't true then, and it's not true today. Nowhere in this bill does it say that people are compelled to use somebody's personal pronoun. It doesn't say that anywhere. No one has ever been prosecuted. Nobody has ever been fined for this in Canada. Ultimately, it's about respect, isn't it, really? And trans people deserve respect. And I think they're probably tired of the debate and argument by the 95 or so % majority heterosexual people that are pushing this into the media as a big issue. And my own country is probably one of the most discriminatory countries in Western Europe, or indeed the West, when it comes to trans issues. At least in the case of the Conservative government, where it was a rush to the bottom for the Conservative leadership party a few years ago to see who could be the most transphobic person to get up on a platform. But based on a big fat whopping lie with bells on it, essentially, Peterson shot to fame for his opposition of Bill C-16. And this is what he said about it at the time.
Well, so what am I willing to do? Well, I think that the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal is probably obligated by their own tangled web to bring me in front of it. If they find me, I won't pay it. If they put me in jail, I'll go on a hunger strike. I'm not doing this. And that's that. I'm not using the words that other people require me to use, especially if they're made up by radical left-wing ideologues. Now, if our society comes to some sort of consensus over the next while about how we'll solve the pronoun problem, let's call it, and that becomes part of popular parlance, and it seems to solve the problem properly without sacrificing the distinction between singular and plural, and without requiring me to memorize an impossible list of an indefinite number of pronouns, then I would be willing to reconsider my position.
And what Peterson ended up doing was essentially using his tenure as a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, this clash with his claim to compelling of freedom of speech, whether it was inadvertent or not, he absolutely used this as a massive platform to monetize hate. I think this clip speaks for itself.
Climate change one is a weird one. So
that's because there's no such thing as climate, right? Climate and everything are the same word. And that's what bothers me about the climate change types. It's like, this is something that bothers me about it technically. It's like, well, climate is about everything. So, okay. But your models aren't based on everything. Your models are based on a set number of variables.
Yeah.
So that means you've reduced the variables, which are everything, to that set. Well, how did you decide which set of variables to include in the equation if it's about everything? And that's not just a criticism. That's like, if it's about everything, your models aren't right. Because your models do not and cannot model everything.
Climate is everything. And if climate's everything, how can you choose which set? No! What the about? What the No, climate change is very simply the measure of the global temperature of the Earth over a period of about 2,000 years. And scientists have used all the data sources they can find to get a fairly accurate picture of the temperature of the Earth over this period of time, with going forward into 1850 onwards, more reliable records. Records historically were measured by things like ice cores, sea sediment analysis, tree ring analysis, of which there are many global sets of data. And scientists have put all these data sets together and they've worked out a way to extract the temperature information. So why would you not believe what climate scientists are saying? Look, here's the chart, okay? It's not fucking rocket science, is it? Look, and these temperatures here, going back, were reliably measured through the aforementioned methods. They're not 100% accurate, but they're fairly accurate. And then going forward here, bang, right here, that's the start of the Industrial Revolution, when we started to emit CO2. And here is, you can see that they started to increase with the use of combustion engines and manufacturing output and everything like that. And the dip here is because of fossil fuel particles, which blocked out the sun. And then obviously here, emissions continued to increase exponentially. And up here, yeah, like you can bloody see it's there. That's the freaking graph, yeah? It's pretty fucking easy to understand. And it's easy to understand how the data was collected from a layman's perspective, for fuck's sake. So, look, I mean, it's going to carry on going up like that, right? It's going to carry on increasing. The temperature is going to go up quite clearly. I think that's what the main issue is all about, isn't it? I'm not going to go on about this one because I really don't think there's much to say about it. Peterson has a tenuous connection about writing some paper on a UN climate committee, but the paper is of little consequence or information. And even by his own admissions, he's admitted that he doesn't have a head for mathematics, as neither do I. But I don't think it's some grand conspiracy theory where people have to bend to the will of Marxist conspiracists. It's a very real problem that's going to cause people lots of issues in about 100 years. If nothing's done, temperatures rise, then ocean levels will rise, and people living in coastal areas and the more vulnerable areas in the global south will be deeply impacted. And at least to not admitting to the clear information, it's ignorance, essentially. Peterson seems to be very obsessed with IQ, and he mentions it again and again on his lecture tours. He states that people with the high percentile IQ can have a good job like a lawyer or a doctor, and those down the lower percentile of the figures, those with an IQ of around about 87 to 93, can only ever perform simple jobs like packing, factory work, or janitor work. He then goes on to state that people with lower IQ are essentially unemployable people in society. But I kind of find this a problematic argument in a sense. If you take someone that's lived on, say, a rural farm, but they might not have had the education that someone who lived in, say, a city had. The person who lived on that farm could be extraordinarily intelligent and could have the ability to adapt in the relevant role if given the opportunity, whereas the person with the city education could have potentially a higher trained IQ on paper, but may not necessarily adapt as well as the person with the higher intelligence. However, those IQ ratings could come out in the wash as being different. So the person on the farm could have a lower IQ and the person with a city education could have a higher IQ. So essentially, IQ can also change throughout a person's life, and it's also something that can be trained for as well to increase. Peterson's assertion that people with a low IQ score are essentially useless or unemployable oversimplifies a complex issue. Whilst IQ scores may correlate with certain job performance metrics, they are not the sole determinant of a person's employability. And there's many factors that contribute to an individual's employability, including skills, work ethic, adaptability, emotional intelligence, and interpersonal abilities. If you reduce employability to an IQ score, it ignores these essential aspects. And also, if you base someone's employment on their IQ score, it would essentially perpetuate stigma and discrimination. But he always seems to close down on the very same point about the people with the low IQ being of no use to anybody in any capacity within any profession. And it's the lack of solution to this problem that I have an issue with. And so if there's nothing that can be done for them, what's the point in going on about that quite a lot? I mean, what's the actual position that's being put across here? I think it could be potentially an affectation of Peterson's obsession with the Pareto distribution and the order of hierarchy.
There's no place in our cognitively complex society for 1 in 10 people. So what are we going to do about that? The answer is no one knows. You say, well, shovel money down the hierarchy. It's like, the problem isn't lack of money. I mean, sometimes that's the problem, but the problem is rarely absolute poverty. It's rarely that. It is sometimes, but rarely. It's not that easy to move money down the hierarchy. So, first of all, it's not that easy to manage money. So, it's a vicious problem, man. And so,
it's hard to train people to become creative, adaptive, problem solvers.
It's impossible. You can't do it.
And there you have it. Forget that lower percentile. Fuck them. Chuck them in a bin. Forget about them. Brilliant. Thanks, Jordan. On the 22nd of June 2022, Peterson posted a double whammy on Twitter. Let's have a look at what Peterson has to say.
I've essentially been banned from Twitter as a consequence. I say banned, although technically I have been suspended. But the suspension will not be lifted unless I delete the hateful tweet in question, and I would rather die than do that. And hopefully it will not come to that, although who the hell knows in these increasingly strange days.
It's all a bit dramatic, isn't it? I mean, he'd rather die than delete the tweet. So if someone put a shotgun up to him and threatened to, pull the trigger, he'd literally say, yeah, you better just pull that trigger, guys. I don't think so.
What was it that I said that caused such a fuss? And that fuss is just beginning. And even more importantly and complexly, what exactly was it that I said that resulted in the ban? Here is the tweet in question. Remember when pride was a sin? And Ellen Page just had her breasts removed by a criminal physician.
King hell, the physician is not a criminal by any stretch of the law. It's a factious statement. And it kind of seems as though he's kind of got a sort of a weird sort of fetishization going on here. And then what was the whole point in remember when pride used to be a sin? I get the point. He's saying that it used to be a biblical reference, but now it's no longer a biblical reference because the gays have stolen it as our term. Well, who gives a It could be both, right? You can still use pride within the biblical sense of the word. They haven't taken it away from you. You can still talk about it in the context of Genesis or whatever you want to get from the Bible.
The response from Twitter, quote, violating our rules against hateful conduct. You may not promote violence against, threaten, or harass other people on the basis of race, ethnicity, national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, religious affiliation, age, disability, or serious disease. By clicking delete, you acknowledge that your tweet violated the Twitter rules. Delete.
Yeah, well, you violated Twitter's terms and conditions clearly twice in a double whammy, right? Jesus. And when you sign up to Twitter or when you log in, he will ask you to accept the terms and conditions, of which he accepted and broke. Because I don't know if anybody's forgotten, but in the context of Twitter then, it was, before Elon Musk took it over and trashed it, it was an advertising-based revenue platform. If advertisers are going to come on and see anti-gay speech and anti-trans speech on a very popular, verified Twitter user, a celebrity, And they're going to pull away from it, aren't they? Advertisers are going to drop out left, right, and centre. I mean, when it boils down to it, it's about capitalism. And you would think that Jordan Peterson, being advocator of capitalism and taking responsibility for your own actions, you'd think that he would have A, foreseen the consequences of his actions, and B, as a clinical psychologist, it's not very empathetic, is it? Quite frankly, to do that. But I suppose it boils down to, is or was Twitter an absolute free speech platform? And the answer is, well, no, it's not. If you want to post that kind of shit, then there are other platforms that you can quite willingly go and hang out on with, your other haters. In May of 2022, Jordan Peterson commented on model Yumi Nu, who appeared on Sports Illustrated's swimsuit cover. In response to the plus-size model, Peterson tweeted the following: "Sorry, not beautiful, and no amount of authoritarian tolerance is going to change that." Sorry, that was my Jordan Peterson impression. It wasn't particularly good, but I think I got the whiny nuances in there. Peterson said that using a non-athletic model to model sportswear was exploitative and manipulative. And he also had this to say:
even if you're a very beautiful woman, you're hard pressed to be beautiful enough to be on the cover of Sports Illustrated for the swimsuit issue. And so it's a pinnacle achievement of sorts, and it's focused on a very idealized and specific form of beauty. And that's obviously exclusionary. It's obviously exclusionary. It excludes everyone. Mm-hmm. Right. And it does that to highlight a kind of ideal, and that's a particular ideal of beauty. And there are some cultural boundaries around that. So you could say, well, it's a westernized form of beauty. It's like, yeah, and you can point to Rubens' paintings of more plump women and say, well, there's an exception. It's like, great. You think you're a genius for finding that exception. Good for you. You know the Rubens painting. Like, more power to you. But that doesn't mean anything at all about the universality of images of beauty. And so the cover bothered me a lot because it was a cheap manipulation of something that had been working very well for Sports Illustrated. It was also an insistence that all of a sudden this non-athletic body type is as beautiful as the standard swimsuit model for Sports Illustrated. And it's not. It's not as athletic, and it's not as healthy. And that's that. And it's also not arbitrary. And so the whole thing is a lie. And then it's a lie that's a manipulation of that young woman. Now, she partakes in that because she participates in it. But it's still, they're not on her side. They're exploiting her, as far as I'm concerned. And she may be participating in that exploitation, but they're still exploiting her. So don't pull any moral stunts on me because you're irritated about my opinion about the Sports Illustrated cover when it's bloody clear to anybody with eyes that that was manipulative in 20 different ways. And I'm also not willing to sacrifice these ideals.
Look, I'm willing to grant him, and I understand where he's kind of coming from in a sense, in that it probably shouldn't be the norm that people are obese and overweight. And I say this as an overweight person, right? Look at these bloody jowls. These could come off, but need to get down the gym. But I take on board his point that the normalization of an unhealthy body might not necessarily be the best thing for society. But on the other hand, saying sorry, not beautiful, is like a direct insult to this woman. And I would say that you could argue that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? Beauty is subjective. Everybody finds something different. And some guys like going out with larger women, and some guys don't care about it. But it's just the sheer bullishness and crudeness about it, and the direct insult. You don't have to look at the picture. And also, in a way, I think it's something a little bit creepy about it. Nearly 60-year-old man looking at a woman in the 20s going, that's not hot. I wouldn't want to do that. It's creepy. I mean, that's not directly what he was saying, clearly. But you get the point. Look, it was their magazine. It was their choice. And if you say they're exploiting her, it's kind of an inference that the standards of beauty have to be set in stone as an objective standard mandated by Jordan Peterson, that standards over time can't change and they have to be set to this one specific hip to waist ratio that Jordan talks about? And how does Peterson know that the editors set out to humiliate her? I suspect they were just trying to push the boundaries and thought that potentially things had moved on with regards to what could be acceptable as a set of principles that were prescribed measurement for beauty. And the Western standard of what is classed as beautiful by the classic standard isn't a universal standard either. And Peterson seems angry that magazines could even attempt to push at this boundary. How dare they? And it's kind of ironic that Peterson says that it's authoritarian for a magazine to use a different body type when he is suggesting that there should be only one set of standards of hip to waist ratio. And whilst I understand that there may be a health issue behind this, which swingometer do you think that Peterson is more towards? Is it the health of people, or is it the absolute offence that the boundaries of what should be beauty have been pushed? Well, I'll let the audience decide. And how can you say that they're not exploiting other women in the magazine? So it's exploitation to put a fat woman in there, but not a thin woman? And if you don't agree with it, then fuck off and don't buy the magazine. If you like it, buy it. But I also get the point of essentially that it's promoting an unhealthy body. So I kind of feel a little bit conflicted by it. But I also don't think it's Peterson's place to even say what a 20-something woman should look like essentially in a magazine. Although you could argue that he's a clinical psychologist and therefore he's done the research. He seems to know his waist to hip ratio. Anyway, that's it for today's video. If you've absolutely hated everything I've said, then please leave a comment in the comment section below. Or if you liked it, please comment as well. Thanks.